Well, I have to be honest with you, when I heard that Brad, the elders, had decided that we were going to study the book of Job together, my first thought was, yay, Job. Because Job is not a happy book, right? Even if it has a good ending, it's not a happy book, and nor is it short. So it's a long, unhappy book, right? One long slog through misery, but then that's how you might have described certain periods of your own life. And if you haven't, you probably will. And you understand that when you are in the middle of adversity, when you're in the middle of suffering, an hour feels like a month. I think one reason why the Lord is giving us these long poetic segments in the book of Job is so it feels long. It's God's way of saying, I get it. This feels long to you, because it does. And yet there's something important to hear in it. Obviously, the book of Job is to prepare us for adversity and suffering. And the main way to prepare for that is just to understand who God really is. See, your fantasies or illusions about God will not help you in a hard day. Those will not help you at all. So you have to have the truth. There's bad news in the book of Job, and there's good news in the book of Job as well. When you're in the middle of those difficult periods of life, what you don't want to hear but do want to hear is the truth about it, right? In other words, you do not want to hear that your house is on fire unless it is. Then you want to hear it, right? You do not want to hear that you have a malignant tumor unless you do. I remember going to London on a vacation with some family members, and I remember very first day I'm standing in some museum of art in London, and I get a phone call from our son-in-law, Andy Davis. So I'm in London, and I get the thing, and Andy Davis is calling me. Andy Davis didn't call me when I was in the country, right? And he called me to tell me that our basement was flooded and that he was handling it, which he did. It was not good news, and from 4,000 miles away, there was nothing I could do about it. But I'm glad he called me. I'm glad he told me that, right? I'm also glad he handled it, right? And so we kind of approach the book of Job that way. So we get some hard news, but I'm glad to know it if it's true. And then what's the good news that goes alongside it? That's kind of what we're dealing with in the book of Job. Something to hang on to when life gets very hard and very difficult. Because suffering does strange things to our thinking. It does strange things to our thinking. And so we need to remember some basic things. Now, we're starting today in chapter 4 of the book of Job. And now for the next many chapters, what we're seeing is a conversation between Job and primarily three friends. I put the word friends in quotes, not because they weren't really friends, but because they were more like colleagues to Job. Not that these guys were just sitting around having a drink together all the time, not necessarily that kind of friend. They didn't actually live down the block, probably. But they were colleagues, and they had mutual respect for one another, enough respect to Job that when he got into all this difficulty, they came to him. And the three friends are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Now, later on in the book, a guy by the name of Elihu shows up, makes a long speech, but somehow he factors differently than these three. So these are the three friends of Job, and now beginning in chapter 4, there's these conversations. One of the friends will speak, and Job will answer him. Another friend will speak, and Job will answer him. A third friend will speak, and Job will answer him. And then the first one will speak again. Okay, so today we're looking at chapters 4 through 7, the first speech of Eliphaz in chapters 4 and 5, and then Job's response to Eliphaz in chapters 6 and 7. There's about 99 verses in those 4 chapters, and we're not reading all of them, but maybe just under a third of them to get a flavor for what these guys are saying. Now, All of the three friends are basically saying the same thing, a little different nuance and a little different attitude. So Eliphaz speaks first. That's what we're looking at this morning. He was probably the oldest, which is why he's speaking first. He's definitely the most diplomatic. So I picture a guy who's been mellowed by age. Isn't that a nice way for us old people to think of ourselves? Mellow. He's been mellowed by age, so he's being diplomatic and he's being kind, right? The other guys are a good bit more harsh in what they say to Job, but Eliphaz speaks first. And when he speaks, he's sort of giving us the perspective that all of them had. And so what you're going to hear this morning from Eliphaz, you're going to hear this again. And how Job responds to Eliphaz, he's going to say some of those things again, okay, just so you know. So it's kind of helpful for us to get a grip on this. Now, how do we understand these speeches from the three friends? It's a big book. We can get all sort of mired in the poetic language, and we can feel the depression and the angst and all that. But how do we interpret this in a way sort of keep our head enough above water to actually hear what God is saying in it? And I think, for me at least, a very helpful principle comes from chapter 42, verse 7 of Job, which was referred to before, earlier, when God finally speaks at the end. This is in the epilogue to the book. Okay, so God speaks, and then Job speaks, and he repents in dust and ashes. You know how that story goes. And then it says this in chapter 42, verse 7, after the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, so that's the guy we're going to listen to in chapters 4 and 5. He said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now that response from God is a little bit surprising because a lot of what those three friends say is true. And a lot of what Job says is rash and emotional, not entirely rational or helpful. But when God gets done listening to everybody and he's going to put it in a sentence, basically what he's saying is the basic perspective that the three friends are coming from when they portray God is wrong. And the basic perspective that Job is coming from as he's responding to them is right. Now notice what God says. He says to Eliphaz, you have not spoken, I'm angry with you and your two, because you have not spoken of me what is right. So basically, it's not talking about what you think of life, but what you think of God. So the theology of the three friends is somewhat skewed. Now, a lot of what they believe about God is correct, right? But there's an overall perspective that's not right. God says that wasn't right. You weren't right about that when you were talking about me that way, God says. So, how do we understand these speeches? You look for the ways in which the three friends were wrong about God, and look for the way in which Job was right about God. Because the three friends are going to say lots of good, true things about God, and that's good. But this book is trying to show us something, and so look for the ways that they were wrong and look for the ways that Job is right. And we'll see that in this passage, chapters 4 through 7. So that's where we're going to turn. Okay, so just using that as our sort of our interpretive grid, what we're going to say is, how was Eliphaz wrong in what he said about God? Let me just read you a few verses. Chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. Eliphaz says to Job, I'm skipping his introduction. He says, consider now, he says to Job, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. At the breath of God they are destroyed. At the blast of his anger they perish. He's simply saying this: righteous people are not destroyed, and those who sow trouble reap it. It's very simple. Is that true? Yes. You see what I'm saying? There's a lot of truth in that. You could bring Bible verses to back up some of those statements, and yet, is that an accurate way to think about God? Basically, what he's saying is, Eliphaz is saying, there's no real injustice on the earth. Everybody actually gets what they deserve. The righteous are not destroyed, and those who plow evil do reap it. You see what Eliphaz is implying? Job, you think this is unjust? No, there's no such thing. You see, Job and his three friends all agree on this: God is just. That's true. You believe that. God is just. So how do you make sense of injustice? Eliphaz makes sense of it this way: it doesn't exist. There's no real injustice. Okay? Now read on here, verses 17 and 19. Eliphaz says this: can a mortal man be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? If God places no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who live in houses of clay, humans, whose foundations are in the dust, who are crushed more readily than a moth? If God even sees the inabilities and weaknesses and sins of the angels, think about the fallen angels, then of course human beings, we're all bad. Is that true? Yes. But if the implication is then, so everything bad that happens to you is because you were bad, is that true? You begin to get a feel for how this book works, all right? Look at chapter 5, verse 8. Chapter 5, verse 8. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, verse 3. Go to verse 3 first. I myself have seen a fool taking root. Now that seems to go against what he was saying. Taking root means being established, successful. I've seen a fool taking root, but suddenly his house was cursed. His children are far from safety, crushed in court without a defender. The hungry consume his harvest, taking it even from among thorns, and the thirsty pant after his wealth. For hardship does not spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. Yet man is born to trouble as surely as the sparks fly upward. So sometimes you might see a fool or an evil man looking like he's prospering and successful, but it's only temporary. Injustice in this world, it's only brief, because pretty soon, bam, the bad guy gets it. That's what he's saying. Is that true? Okay, so if that's true, then applied to Job, here's the conclusion he's going to come to, verse 8. He's going to suggest that Job do business with God this way. Verse 8, but if I were you, I would appeal to God. I would lay my cause before him. Skip down to verse 17. Blessed is the man whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. I appreciate about this. I appreciate Eliphaz about this, that he's trying to be somewhat redemptive, right? But clearly what he's saying is, Job, there's no injustice in this world. You are suffering because God is disciplining you for an error, a sin, a fault that you have yet to acknowledge. And if I were you, I would go before God and lay my case before him. Basically, confess your sin, Job, and he will heal. He'll undo this misery. When you read Eliphaz's words in verses 17 and 18, they feel so redemptive and good. But they are in the context of him saying, you are suffering for your sin. confess your sin and give it up, and this will all go away. Is that true? Is that what you think when you are in your adversity? Now, I'm going to tie this all together, but let's first look at Job's response. Job's response to him. So we're in chapter 6, and I'm going to skip down to verse 8. And Job says this. In some sense, he's not responding directly to Eliphaz. He's responding to the situation in spite of what Eliphaz has said. But he says this in verse 8, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for." What is he asking? That God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut me off. Then I would have this consolation, my joy and unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One. You see what Job is saying? He's saying, I wish God would kill me. You may say, well, that's a death wish. That's suicidal thoughts. He should be put on medication. No, but look what he's saying. He said, I wish God would kill me now while I'm still hanging on to him, so that I would die with my integrity, so that I would die in faith. Remember what his wife said? His wife said, curse God and die. What Job is saying is that what he really wants to do is bless God and die. He wants to die faithful. Now what Eliphaz has said is, Job, you haven't been entirely faithful. You've blown it, and that's why you're suffering. And Job knows in the depths of his heart he cannot, for the life of him, find the unfaithfulness, the sin and failure that his three friends are talking about. And what he'd really like to do is die and end the pain in his integrity. That's what he's saying. But read on. Look what else Job has to say in chapter 7. First look at verse 9 of chapter 7. He says, remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. My eyes will never see happiness again. So he's praying. I quote verse 7. I read verse 7 just so you know that beginning of verse 11, he's still talking to God. This is still his prayer when he says, therefore, verse 11, therefore I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the monster of the deep, that you put me under guard? When I think my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, even then you frighten me with dreams. You terrify me with visions, so that I prefer strangling and death rather than this body of mine. I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone. My days have no meaning. Look what he's saying to God. He's saying, you have targeted me, and I wish you would just leave me alone. Keep reading. What is man that you make so much of him, that you give him so much attention, that you examine him every morning and test him every moment? Will you never look away from me or let me alone even for an instant? You see what Job is saying? God, quit hounding me. God, quit standing over me with your heavy hand. God, quit looking in my eyes and scowling at me. Just leave me alone. He said, well, that's a terrible thing to say to God. You know it's just as bad, if not worse? God, you've left me so alone. I'm abandoned. You're nowhere to be seen. You have no idea what's going on in my life. And frankly, that's been my response more. My response in adversity has been feeling like I've been abandoned by God, feeling like God isn't paying any attention at all. See, here's where Job was right. In his suffering, he understood, oh no, you haven't been abandoned by God at all. He is right in your face. Job said, God, would you just get out of my face? This is miserable, right? And maybe that attitude is troubling, but he was right about God. that God is in the midst of it. Now, let's put all of this together. We could look at it this way. There's two false beliefs that can come out of suffering. And then if we turn it, we could say there are two realities to hold on to in our suffering, okay? So they're already clear, but let me just summarize it for you. Number one, false belief number one that can come out of suffering is that suffering is always the consequence of some sin or moral failure. That's false. It's not. That's not always the case. Do you remember Jesus' encounter in John chapter 9? Some of you already thought about it. Here's a man born blind, right? And the disciples come up to Jesus, using him as a demonstration, which itself is troubling. And they say, Jesus, who has sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Just take that question at face value. What did this guy do before he was born to deserve this? What? So they threw in the parents in case it was their fault. The assumption is this adversity is the consequence of somebody's sin. Who was it? And before you look at the disciples and say, they're spiritually immature, just consider how often we see some teenager going off the rails, and immediately we wonder, what was going on in that home? Well, you know, those parents were pretty harsh. We have that tendency, don't we? Don't we kind of think that when bad things happen to people, well, yeah, but they sort of, they did something unwise, they made a mistake, We come at this whole thing as if maybe there isn't that much injustice in the world. And here's the reality, and here's the truth to hang on to. Yeah, there's that much injustice in the world. It really is bad. Innocent people suffer, and guilty people get off scot-free. As far as we are concerned, as far as we can see, yep, that actually happens. This world is full of injustice. There are plenty of parents who were intentional, prayerful, faithful, and hardworking, who have children who walk away from God. Yeah, that's the world we live in. That's right. Innocent people get hit by drunk drivers and have their life cut short. Yep. Now, God wants us to face this reality. We live in a world full of injustice. It's a myth to think that we don't. False belief number two, that suffering is evidence of God's abandonment of the sufferer. That the nearness of God always entails ease and comfort. Let me say that again. It is an error to think that the nearness of God always entails ease and comfort. Not true, right? And so the truth to hang on to is your suffering is not evidence that God is a million miles away, and if anything, He is closer to you in your suffering than ever before. And there are people in this room who can give testimony to that. That it was not until they suffered, not until they experienced adversity, that they understood the closeness of God. Not because God just decided to get close to them in their suffering, but it was in their suffering that they realized how close He always was, so to speak, right? And that's what Paul was trying to say in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Because of these surpassing visions that I had, in order to keep me from being proud, Paul said, thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan. Note that. It was a thorn in the flesh, and he called it a messenger of Satan. So recall Job chapters 1 and 2, this encounter with Satan, right? It was given me. And I pled with the Lord 3 times that it might be removed from me. But God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made what? perfect. That's the word I'm looking for. I just read it in 3 versions, and I couldn't come up with a word. Made perfect in weakness. My power is made perfect in weakness. Now, everybody in this room thinks the favor of God, the grace or favor of God, is a great thing. Everybody in this room thinks the power of God is a great thing. But what if the grace and power of God only came to you as gifts from God as He approached you in your suffering? What if the things that God brought with Him to hospital rooms, the things that God brought with Him to funeral homes, the things that God brought with Him to give people in adverse circumstances, that's where you get the grace and power of God. What if that were true? Paul understood that, and so he said, most gladly, therefore, I will rather glory in my infirmities that the power of Christ might. You know what he said? He said, yeah, the suffering's worth it. The power of Christ, yeah. If it comes in suffering, give me the suffering, because that's worth it. That's what Paul said. It's amazing, isn't it? You see, contrary to the view of Eliphaz and his friends, God does not turn His back on evil and godlessness, nor does He immediately end it. If He did, now think about this, if God did, Satan would never have been allowed in His presence in chapters 1 and 2 to begin with. Right? You ever watch those movies with good guys and bad guys? It's the only kind I want to watch these days. And the good guy is standing there, and the bad guy is, the movie is designed to make you hate the bad guy and hope he gets his. And the good guy is just taking it. He's just taking it and taking it, and he was a Navy SEAL and he could do all these things even though he's just a bag boy at the grocery store now. And you just want to say, hit him, come on, hit him, right? And he stands there, and he stands there, and he stands there because this movie has to last for 2 hours. Here's what God does in the face of injustice. He stands there and looks it in the eye. Satan walks up to him in the court of heaven to accuse Job, and God looks him in the eye and talks to him. That's a hard theological reality, that God stands in the face of evil and stands there and looks at it. But that's the reality. God faces it. He wades in it. And isn't that what you see in Jesus? Isn't that what you see in Jesus? Satan came to Him to tempt Him. Satan came to the creator of the universe to tempt Him to evil. And Jesus stood there and took it once, twice, 3 times. And the gospel tells us that Satan left Him for a while. Why didn't Jesus just give him what's coming to him? But He didn't. He stood there. He didn't destroy Satan. Jesus faced demon-possessed people. And guess what? He didn't destroy the demon. He healed the people. He did not destroy the demon. He faced the Pharisees, the very people who at that moment were conspiring to put Jesus to death. Those people, Jesus faced them, and He did not destroy the Pharisees. He stood there in front of them and faced them. Do you see something about God in this world full of injustice? God is not a million miles away. He's in the middle of it. You're in the middle of suffering. You're in the middle of adversity. He is not away from you. He's in it with you. Jesus is the proof of that. The very fact that He came to this world to begin with was Him coming into injustice and living in it for 33 years. And in you, by His Spirit living in you, He's still living in this unjust world. He's not apart from it. He's not away from it. He's in it with you. Know that about Jesus. His very incarnation is proof of that. That's what Job understood about God. That God was not a million miles away. He was absolutely in it with him. He does not abandon his people in the midst of it. And Jesus is proof enough of that. So the worship team is coming, and we're going to sing, "We Will Feast in the House of Zion." So here's part of the hope. Here's part of the good news. I don't know what justice looks like in so many cases, and I don't, for the life of me, see how it can possibly be in the next week, month, years, my lifetime. But this is what I know. God is just, and he's working a good plan, and one day we will feast in the house of Zion. One day we will stand before him, and we'll understand the mystery. Eliphaz was trying to say there is no mystery. Really, everything that's happening makes sense when you stop and think about it. But no, that's not true. There's great mystery here. Job is wrestling with a mystery, and we're going to wrestle with mystery until we face him in his presence face to face. Until then, he's with us in this muck and mire, and we look forward with hope to feasting in the house of Zion. Stand with me and let's sing. Listen to the words of this song as you sing it together. We will feast in the house of Zion.